The detention cell smelled like recycled air and old fear. Lieutenant Maya Torres had been in worse places, but few
The
that carried
silence
this particular
screams their
weight of
names.
institutional authority.
We
The Vraxians didn't do
are the
anything
echo
halfway.
of the lost
Not
fleet.
conquest, not ceremony, and certainly not military justice. 3 senior officers stood before her, their scales shifting through colors that her outdated translator implant struggled to interpret. 4 centuries of unbroken supremacy had made them dangerously confident. They wore their authority like armor, each medal on their dress uniforms representing victories that humanity had only heard about in whispered warnings. Commander Threx leaned forward, his pupils contracting to dangerous pinpricks. Explain how you came into possession of Admiral Krevoth's personal identification seal. Maya glanced down at her dented chest plate, at the stamped metal she'd almost forgotten was there. Fresh bruising spread across her cheekbone from the patrol that had dragged her off the transport. Her knuckles were split, bleeding slowly onto their pristine floor, but her posture remained casual, almost bored. "Found it," she said simply. The second officer, Nexel, made a clicking sound with his mandibles that her implant translated as 17 different variations of disbelief. "You found the most closely guarded cryptographic signature in the Vraxian fleet. Life's full of coincidences."
Defense protocols are now
Rex's
active.
scales flushed
All
crimson,
hands,
combat
battle
readiness,
stations.
anger
I
barely
expect nothing
restrained.
less than total
Admiral
victory.
Krevoth has been
Mercenary,
missing for 43
engage the
cycles.
fleet.
His ship
Failure
was
is
discovered
not an
adrift
option.
in the Korova wastes with no crew, no bodies, and no explanation. He paused, letting the weight settle. "And now you appear wearing his seal like a trophy." Maya met his gaze without flinching. "You asked how I got it. I told you. Whether you believe me is really more of a you problem." The third officer, a younger male named Victor, circled behind her like a predator. "Scans show Vraxian blood residue on your armor, 3 distinct genetic markers. Would you like to revise your story?" "Not particularly." The silence stretched tight as a tripwire. "Where is Admiral Krevoth?" Threx's voice had dropped to something that would make wiser creatures nervous. "Dead." The word landed like a concussive charge. Nexel's secondary hands clenched. Victor stopped circling. Even Threx, veteran of countless campaigns, looked like he'd been struck. "You admit to killing a Vraxian admiral," Threx said carefully. "I admitted he's dead. Your words, not mine." "Human, linguistic evasion will not." Maya shifted forward, and her armor creaked in ways that suggested recent violence. "You pulled me off that transport, dragged me here, and started asking questions you probably don't want answered. So let's clarify what we're actually doing. Are you investigating what happened to your admiral, or are you trying to decide how publicly to execute me?" "Those are not mutually exclusive options," Nexel said quietly. "Fair point." Maya smiled, which somehow made her split lip look worse. "But here's the thing about your Admiral Krevoth the Unyielding, last of the old guard, victor of the Traverse campaigns, never retreated, never surrendered, never lost a ship under his command. That's who we're talking about, right? You will not speak his name with such." "In 400 years of Vraxian military history," Maya continued, ignoring the interruption, "not a single admiral has ever died in combat. They retire to halls of valor. They give speeches. They become legends." She paused, watching their reactions. "None of them die in some random skirmish in the wastes with no witnesses, no enemy engagement logged, and no distress signal sent." Threx's scales flickered between crimson and an unhealthy gray. "What are you suggesting?" "Not suggesting anything. I'm pointing out that you've got a dead hero, a mystery you can't solve, and a human with his ID literally stamped into her armor." Maya leaned back against the wall. "Now you can kill me. That's absolutely an option. But then you'll never know what actually happened. You'll just have more questions and one really uncomfortable ceremony where you have to invent something to tell his bloodline." Containment field hummed. Somewhere, Maya's blood dripped steadily onto the floor. The 3 Vraxian officers exchanged glances. A silent conversation happening in scale colors, and mandible movements that her implant couldn't fully translate. We could enhance interrogation protocols, Victor suggested carefully. Maya actually laughed, sharp and bitter. You could try. Humans have a pretty high pain tolerance, but sure, go ahead. Just know that torture is basically you asking me to tell you what you want to hear instead of what actually happened. She met his gaze. Your call. Threx stood abruptly, his chair scraping against metal. You have one opportunity to explain yourself before I authorize Victor's suggestion. One question first. Maya's voice carried something that wasn't quite defiance, wasn't quite respect. You sure you want to know what happened to him? Because I can tell you exactly how Admiral Krevoth the Unyielding spent his final days. But once you hear it, you can't unhear it. Your legends stay legends or they become something else entirely. Can't have both. The truth, Maya interrupted, is rarely what people actually want, especially when it comes to heroes. Nexel and Victor looked at Threx. Threx looked at the dented chest plate, at the ID stamp that was definitely, unmistakably, authentically Admiral Krevoth's personal seal, at the human who wore it like she had every right to. Tell us, he said finally, what happened to our Admiral? Maya settled back against the wall, wincing slightly. You're going to want to sit down for this, and probably disable about half your recording equipment. Why would we? Because what I'm about to tell you is going to make you question everything you think you know about honor duty, and why humans get hired for the jobs nobody else will touch. She studied their faces, gauging how much truth they could handle. Your Admiral didn't die in battle, Commander. He hired me to help him die like he lived, on his own terms. The detention cell felt suddenly smaller, the air thicker. 3 Vraxian officers stood frozen, caught between duty and a truth they hadn't prepared for. 49 cycles ago, Maya began, I was drinking synthetic whiskey in a port station so far from civilized space that the star charts listed it as problematic. That's where your Admiral found me. Maya watched their faces as she spoke, cataloging every scale color shift, every involuntary movement. Threx had gone perfectly still, the kind of stillness that preceded violence or revelation. He walked into that bar wearing civilian clothes that fooled absolutely nobody. Vraxian military posture is like a fingerprint. You can strip the uniform, but you can't strip 40 years of command presence. She paused, remembering. He sat down, ordered something that smelled like burning plastic, and said he needed someone who understood contracts that exist outside legal frameworks. Impossible, Victor said, his scales flushing orange. Admiral Krevoth would never. Let me finish. Maya's voice carried an edge now. He pulled out a data chip, showed me medical scans. I'm not a doctor, but I've seen enough combat injuries to recognize neural degradation. Something was eating his brain from the inside out, one synapse at a time. He had maybe 60 cycles before the tremors became visible, 90 before he'd start forgetting his own name. The room felt colder suddenly. Virithian nerve parasites, Threx said quietly, his voice barely functional. Transmitted through contaminated water on colony worlds with inadequate filtration. The treaty campaigns, 15 years ago. We lost 400 soldiers before we understood what was happening. He told me the same thing, Maya said, something like respect crossing her features. Told me how your species views that particular death, not as sacrifice in service, not as honorable, as careless. Nexel's mandibles clicked rapidly. The parasite leaves the body intact, only the mind deteriorates. No glorious wound, no visible sacrifice, just diminishment. Exactly. Maya shifted, and her armor caught the harsh lighting. And for someone who'd built a 50-year career on being Krevoth the Unyielding, the idea of spending his final months forgetting which end of a plasma rifle was dangerous. That was worse than any enemy he'd ever faced. She touched the stamped seal on her chest plate. So he made me an offer. He'd provide coordinates to a location in the Korova wastes, supply me with a ship that would leave appropriate weapon signatures, and pay me enough credits to retire on 3 different worlds. In exchange, I'd help him stage his own death in a way that looked like he went down fighting against impossible odds. "You're describing assisted suicide," Victor said, his voice hollow. "I'm describing a soldier who wanted to control how his story ended." "I didn't agree immediately," Maya continued. "I told him it sounded like a job for a Vraxian who understood his culture better than some random human gun for hire." "What did he say?" Threx asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "He laughed, said that was exactly why it had to be me. Any Vraxian who helped him would be complicit in dishonoring a superior officer. They'd spend their lives carrying that guilt." She shrugged, the gesture conveying entire philosophical frameworks. "But a human. Humans have different rules about this kind of thing. We don't see helping someone die with agency as betrayal. We see it as respecting their right to choose." Nexel's secondary hands flexed unconsciously. "You took the contract." After making him explain everything 3 times and confirming his medical scans were legitimate, Maya's voice softened slightly. "We spent the next 40 cycles preparing. He showed me his ship security protocols, taught me enough Vraxian naval history to make the scene convincing. And somewhere in there, between planning his own death and arguing about which weapon systems would leave the most believable debris patterns, we started actually talking." She paused, lost in memory for a moment. "He told me about campaigns I'd only heard rumors about. I told him about contracts that would make your security officers have collective seizures. He was curious about human military philosophy, especially our approach to asymmetric warfare." "This is absurd," Victor said, but he didn't sound convinced anymore. "The last week, the parasite started affecting his motor control. Minor tremors in his left hand. He'd drop things and then stare at his fingers like they'd betrayed him." Maya's eyes hardened. "That's when I asked if he was absolutely certain. Told him he could still walk away, accept whatever medical options existed, spend his remaining time with his bloodline." "He refused," Threx said. "It wasn't a question. He said watching his children see him deteriorate would be crueler than any quick death. Said Vraxian honor wasn't about comfort. It was about leaving something that would outlast the physical. And if his final act could be framed as one more impossible victory, then at least his grandchildren would have that story instead of memories of him forgetting their names." The detention cell's air system hummed through the silence that followed. "So on the final day," Maya said, her voice steady despite the weight of what she was describing, "we took his ship into the wastes, set up debris patterns that suggested a multi-ship engagement. He suited up in full Admiral regalia, powered down life support to everything except the command deck, and activated every defensive system simultaneously. Made it look like he'd fought until the ship literally couldn't function anymore." And then, Nexel's voice was barely audible. Maya touched the dented chest plate again, her fingers tracing the stamped seal. "Then he took off his Admiral seal, heated it with a plasma torch, and stamped it into my armor himself. Said someone should carry proof that he'd kept his final contract, that he died exactly how he chose, with someone who understood why that mattered." She paused, and something that might have been grief flickered across her features. "After that, I shot him. Clean headshot, instant, no pain. Exactly what we'd agreed on. Then I collapsed the command deck, set the automated distress beacon to activate on a 40-cycle delay, and left. The ship would look like it had been in combat. His body would tell the story of a final stand, and your species would get to keep its legend." "You executed our Admiral," Victor said, but the accusation had lost its weight. "I kept a promise to a soldier who hired me to help him die as himself instead of as whatever that parasite would have made him." Maya's eyes were steady. "You want to call that execution? Fine. But your Admiral called it mercy, and he paid me to make sure nobody ever questioned what kind of warrior he was." Threx stood motionless for a long moment. Then he moved to the console embedded in the detention wall, his claws hovering over the interface. "There's a simple solution. Admiral Krevoth maintained encrypted personal logs, command-level access only, designed to activate posthumously under specific circumstances. He looked at Maya, something unreadable in his expression. If your account is accurate, there would be evidence. Maya's eyes narrowed. And if you access those logs without proper authorization protocols, then I'll be demoted for violating a superior officer's privacy. Threx's scales had settled into a color that suggested resignation. But I'll have answers. Victor stepped forward suddenly, reaching past Threx toward the console. I'll do it. I'll take full responsibility. Both senior officers turned on him, scales flashing alarm colors. You'll destroy your career, Nexel said. My career doesn't mean much if it's built on executing convenient scapegoats. Victor entered his authorization codes, then looked at Threx. I need senior clearance to complete the access sequence. The detention cell's lighting seemed harsher suddenly, exposing every crack in the walls, every stain on the floor. Threx stared at the console for a long moment, the weight of 4 centuries of tradition pressing down on his shoulders. Then, without speaking, he entered his codes. The logs materialized in holographic display, time-stamped and encrypted with biometric verification that couldn't be falsified. Admiral Krevoth's face appeared, scaled features composed despite visible tremors in his left hand. If you're accessing this, the recording began, then I'm already dead and someone has raised questions about the circumstances. Good, they should. All 3 officers went absolutely still. I contracted a human mercenary to assist with my final operation, not because humans are dishonorable, but because they understand something we've forgotten. Dignity isn't about hiding weakness. It's about choosing how you face it. The Admiral's recorded voice continued, explaining medical details, contractual terms, and philosophical reasoning that matched Maya's account perfectly. But it was his final statement that hit like a weapon's discharge. We've built a culture that demands perfection from our warriors, but provides no framework for graceful decline. We honor sacrifice in battle, but shame those who suffer from injuries that don't show on scanners. If my death forces conversations about these contradictions, then perhaps it will serve a purpose beyond simply ending my own deterioration. The recording ended. The holographic display faded. Nobody moved. Well, Maya said into the silence, now you know. Question is, what are you going to do about it? Threx's scales cycled through colors that suggested internal conflict no translator could adequately render. Finally, he looked at her, really looked at her, not as a criminal but as someone who'd carried an impossible burden with dignity. We'll need time to review this with command, he said quietly, but Lieutenant Torres, thank you for keeping your promise to him. Maya nodded once, understanding the weight of those words from a Vraxian commander. The truth was out, and everything would change. They released Maya 6 hours later with a medical kit she didn't ask for and an apology nobody quite managed to articulate. The bruises on her face had already started fatting. Human healing rates were apparently another surprise the Vraxians hadn't accounted for. Threx walked her to the station's commercial district personally, which felt either like an honor guard or a threat, possibly both. Command reviewed the logs, he said, not looking at her. Official determination is that Admiral Krevoth died during a classified operation in the wastes. All prior commendations remain valid. His family will receive full honors. So you're burying it, Maya said flatly. We're contextualizing it. His scales shifted to neutral gray. There's a difference. Sure there is. Threx stopped walking. Around them, various species conducted commerce and conversation, oblivious to the weight of what they were discussing. 3 other senior officers have submitted requests through back channels, he said quietly. Similar circumstances to Krevoth's, different medical conditions, same essential problem. They're deteriorating in ways our culture doesn't accommodate, and they'd prefer to control their exits. Maya's hand froze halfway to her pack. "You're asking me to?" "I'm informing you that certain individuals may attempt to make contact. What you choose to do with those contacts is your concern." Threx finally met her gaze. "We cannot officially sanction this. We cannot create policy frameworks around it, but we can acknowledge that humans possess certain professional capabilities that address situations our systems fail to handle adequately." Maya stared at him for a long moment, then started laughing, genuinely this time. "This is amazing. You almost executed me for doing exactly what you're now asking me to facilitate on a larger scale." Circumstances evolve, understanding deepens. "Your Admiral predicted this," Maya said, shaking her head. "Told me that if anyone ever figured out what we'd done, the institutional response wouldn't be punishment. It would be recruitment." Threx's scales flickered something that might have been admiration. He knew us well. Maya shouldered her pack, adjusting the chest plate one final time. The stamped seal caught the station's artificial lighting, a permanent reminder of promises kept and dignity preserved. "I'll carry messages," she said finally. "If someone needs help and they find me through channels that don't officially exist, I'll evaluate whether their situation is legitimate. But I won't build you a network. I won't systematize this. The moment it becomes infrastructure, it stops being about individual agency and becomes just another way for institutions to avoid fixing their actual problems." Threx inclined his head, acceptance, respect, understanding. Maya walked away without looking back. 40 minutes later, standing in her ship's cargo bay running pre-flight checks, she heard the comm system activate with an incoming tight beam transmission. Not Vraxian this time. The linguistic patterns suggested Keelerin origin, and the encryption protocols looked expensive. The message was brief: coordinates, a request for consultation, and compensation terms that suggested someone had researched human mercenary rates very thoroughly. Maya looked down at her dented chest plate, at Admiral Krevoth's seal permanently stamped into the metal. She thought about his last words to her, about dignity and choice, and the strange alchemy that sometimes happened when one species' gaps aligned with another's particular strengths. Then she plotted the coordinates and engaged the drive sequence. Some contracts apparently wrote themselves, and humans, inconvenient, uncomfortable, frustratingly unwilling to participate in convenient fictions, would keep accepting them. One dignified death at a time, one promise kept at a time. Because that's what humans did. They endured the uncomfortable truths. They carried the burdens nobody else would touch. They stood in the spaces between honor and necessity, and they didn't flinch. They rose to meet what others couldn't face. And they never, ever broke their word.